Well, welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. The Democrats are getting into the trap. They're ramping up investigations on President Trump. They're issuing subpoenas. They're calling witnesses. They're planning strategy. But they still can't decide whether they should aim for impeachment. I imagine the Republicans are licking their lips with glee if they are. Gary Lane has more.
Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership are walking a fine line. In a conference call yesterday, members are ready to move forward with investigations, but not impeachment. Although the Mueller report found no evidence of collusion with the Russians, they're focusing on at least 10 potential incidents of obstruction of justice listed in that report. The special counsel made no determination on obstruction, but Democrats have 2 points of concern. One was the firing of former FBI Director James Comey. The Mueller report says the president took that action because Comey would not state publicly that the president was not under investigation. The second has to do with Mueller himself. The special counsel's report says the president asked former White House counsel Don McGahn to fire him. On Fox News, former Trump attorney John Dowd says he briefed the president every day about the Mueller investigation.
At no time did the president ever say, you know, John, I'm going to get rid of him. John is not going to do it. It was just the opposite. Here's the message the president had for Bob Mueller, to me, to carry. 1, you tell him I respect what he's doing. Number 2, you tell him he's got my full cooperation.
Regardless, Democrats in the House are moving forward with their investigations. The House Judiciary Committee has subpoenaed McGahn to testify. And battling for the votes from the party's left wing, some Democratic candidates for president are calling for Trump's impeachment. Among them, Kamala Harris.
This president and his administration engaged in obstruction of justice. I believe Congress should take the steps towards impeachment.
And Elizabeth Warren.
This is about principle. And that's why I've asked the House to start impeachment proceedings.
At this point, the Democratic leadership feels impeachment may hurt the party. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is advising against it. Appearing on the CBN News program Faith Nation, ABC political director Rick Klein said he expects impeachment light.
It's going to look like impeachment, but I don't think they're going to go as far as saying these are impeachment proceedings.
At the White House Monday, President Trump appeared confident he'll be able to ride this one out.
Are you worried about impeachment, Mr. President?
The president isn't worried because the Mueller report cleared him of colluding with the Russians. And Trump's defenders say because he wasn't guilty of that, then he's not guilty of obstruction, because there was no crime for the president to obstruct. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Well, Mark Martin is the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. He's now the Dean of Regent University Law School. And Your Honor, it's good to have you with us again. God bless you.
Great to be with you, Pat. Thank you.
What constitutes obstruction of justice? What is it?
Well, for our purposes, there are 3 elements.
All right.
First, there has to be an obstructive act.
All right.
Second, there has to be a nexus between that obstructive act and an official proceeding. And third, there must be corrupt or criminal intent.
All right. So you've got to have an act and a criminal intent. So the fact that a president, for example, is asking one of his subordinates to take it easy on a particular case, that's not obstruction of justice.
No, it is not. Imagine the most challenging day of your life in a family.
All right.
And instead of family members talking about it and thinking about a range of options and then making an informed decision, that all of the intimate details of that family decision are aired for everybody to see. And that is essentially what's happened here. And that's why in this country we've had the doctrine of executive privilege. And that means that the confidential communications between a president and his or her closest associates, the cabinet and staff, are shielded from dissemination, from being disclosed, so that a president can talk about all the options with his closest aides and then make a decision. So I'll give you an example from the Mueller report.
All right.
The allegation that the president improperly tried to terminate the special counsel. So he did have executive communications with his attorney, but ultimately no action was taken outside that zone of communication. So there is absolutely no obstructive act. and no basis for charge.
How could Mueller come up and say, well, we haven't cleared the president? You don't clear somebody because you're presumed innocent, aren't you, until you're proven guilty?
Absolutely. And keep in mind that unlike the independent counsel law, we now have the internal regulation for the special counsel. That's why the special counsel gave the pros and cons of the evidence on obstruction for each of the scenarios, 10 in number. However, the final decision rests with the Department of Justice, and that's exactly what happened here. The very official that authorized the Mueller investigation, Rod Rosenstein, also determined that there was absolutely no obstruction. So there was no collusion and no obstruction.
Well, why are the Democrats acting like some terrible things happened? You heard Kamala Harris just a few minutes ago saying, well, he clearly obstructed justice. Not true?
Not true, right out of the Watergate playbook.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, partisanship has become excessive in our country instead of what's good for the country and good for the American people.
Well, what about the tax returns, for example? You know, does Congress have the right to pick and choose to take one person's tax returns and examine them and make them public? Is that legitimate?
Well, if that is so, I think every American has a lot to fear because if a branch of the federal government can just decide that they want to publicly illuminate any of our tax returns, we no longer have any legitimate right of privacy.
Well, what should Trump's attorneys do in relation to this? I mean, Congress is trying to subpoena actually force Mnuchin at the Treasury Department to give over those tax returns. And of course, his aides said it's so complicated that Congress wouldn't be able to understand them anyhow. But what do you do? The president says, well, it's under audit, I can't do it. But can he be forced to? And if he should, you know, what is the legitimate cause that Congress has?
Well, obviously there are a lot of customs at play here, a lot of traditions about release of tax returns. But at the end of the day, whenever you've been as successful in the business world as Donald Trump, remember, he was known to America as an incredibly successful businessman. And that is why America elected him, hoping that the same success he had had in business could be transferred to the government.
Right.
So if you were someone who wanted to see Donald Trump fail, you know that a worldwide enterprise as complex as Donald Trump's empire would have something to criticize. And so that is why they want these tax returns out into the public.
What do you think, just as an observer of this country? I mean, you know, the Bible says a house divided can't stand and a kingdom divided against itself. You know, doesn't this concern you? Is there anything that the people can do to stop all this partisanship?
Well, I think let's go back to our justice system.
Yeah.
It was founded on the principle that it was a search for truth. And that is where we've gone astray. There has become so much of a jockeying to win the election at all cost that we've forgotten about truth. So when I think about the challenge before the American people, it really is time for us to pull together again and get our eye back on the things that matter.
That's right.
Education that works for our children, economic development and jobs for our people, allowing America to stand tall again. You know, let's remember that with all the Mueller report, it's been documented all the ways that Russia tried to influence our election, all the ways that Russia tried to destabilize America. Russia should be what we're looking at and figuring out how to deal with, not looking back at a presidential election that has at this point almost become a distant memory as all the candidates are jockeying for the next round.
Well, one last question. You're now the dean of the Regent University Law School. How's the law school coming?
It is going terrific. If I was a young person right now and wanted to come to a law school where I know I would have a great chance of getting a job and passing the bar, Regent Law School needs to be #1 on the list.
Well, we'll take that endorsement. Thank you so much for being with us. Come back. All right.
Thank you, Pat.
A brilliant legal mind. You've heard it here, and this is the law, and that's the way it ought to be. Well, in other news, ISIS is claiming responsibility for the terror attack in Sri Lanka that killed more than 300 people on Easter Sunday. John Jessup has more on that.
That's right, Pat. The Islamic State made the claim through its Amaq news agency. Sri Lankan officials now say the bombings were in retaliation for the attack on the Christchurch, New Zealand mosques last month. At least 321 people are dead, with another 500 injured from the attack on churches and hotels. The government says a local Islamist militant group is responsible, but believes it received help from an international terror group. The defense minister blamed weakness within Sri Lanka's security apparatus for failing to prevent the attacks after receiving warnings from international intelligence agencies. The Supreme Court will decide if federal laws against workplace discrimination extend to sexual identity. The court will hear 3 cases involving people who say they were fired because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. One case deals with a male funeral home employee in Michigan who was told he could not come to work dressed as a woman because it violated the company's dress code. Michigan's Equal Employment Commission called the policy discriminatory, ruling that laws against sex discrimination apply to gender identity as well. The Alliance Defending Freedom represents the funeral home. ADF attorney Jim Campbell told CBN Newswatch the case raises an important issue.
Whether unelected officials at the EEOC can unilaterally redefine federal law in order to bring about their political goals. Here, we're dealing with a term that's been in the law for over 50, 60 years. We're dealing with the word sex. And taking the word sex and replacing it with gender identity has widespread consequences in the law.
And, Pat, the Supreme Court will hear this case next fall during its next term.